Once upon a time, Apex Legends had a problem. The competitive scene was growing larger with each year, but growth came with a glaring issue: stagnation. Viewership would eventually stale if things didn't gradually change over the years. New weapons, maps, legends in the comp scene. All of them had to grow and evolve over time. Additions and changes to Apex sought to make that happen. New legends and weapons eventually became staples in competitive, but the third part of that equation failed to develop over the early years of comp Apex. World's Edge, on its release in Season 3 of Apex Legends, became the staple map to play on in competitive. And despite attempts to add different maps into the comp rotation, all of them were met with huge pushbacks by competitive players. Kings Canyon was too small, and the map that came after World's Edge, Olympus, was too open and difficult to rotate in. When these maps were introduced into comp, the results were clear. Competitive couldn't be played on them, and so World's Edge was the only map played in comp Apex. That was until a new map sought to not only be a good competitive map, but also solve the problems World's Edge even faced. A map that wasn't just a good competitive map, but the best you will ever see. Hi, I'm MooreOver, and today, allow me to welcome you to Stormpoint. To make a map that could live up to the high expectations that World's Edge set, there was at least one man for the job who could pull it off. This is Rodney Reese, game designer and former level designer for Respawn Entertainment, with his notable works being the creation of World's Edge and Stormpoint.
And before that, I was 10 years at Naughty Dog, from Uncharted 2 to Uncharted Lost Legacy, so from like Last of Us. So I worked on all those games in, you know, different capacities. That's the quick and dirty version.
Rodney was kind enough to sit down with me to discuss his work in Apex and the design that went into Stormpoint. But before we talk about Stormpoint, we have to understand what led to it.
And the ultimate goal was all of us level designers to dogpile on what was going to be Kings Canyon. But our game director at the time, Mackie, kind of took me aside and said, instead of you working on a section of this map, how about you go prototype a hypothetical second map? Now, at the time, we didn't even know if that was going to be a thing, a second map, because we didn't even know if the game would ship. And that game, you know, or that map became World's Edge.
As development was well underway on Apex Legends, future plans for a second map were placed in the hands of Rodney to develop, while the rest of the dev team focused on Kings Canyon. Since the focus of development was on the first map, this left Rodney a lot of space to develop what would become the second.
Kings Canyon and World's Edge were actually developed simultaneously. The difference was I was the only person working on World's Edge and everybody was working on Kings Canyon because they knew that was going to ship. At this point, World's Edge wasn't even known if that was going to ship. So I kind of had a lot of time to stew as the entire game was ramping up.
Of course, being handed the reins of a second map in early development meant that many major decisions had to be made in its layout to make it unique to the map already planned for release.
As Kings Canyon was developing, you know, I was completely aware of what they were doing, but I kind of had free reign to just sort of figure it out. I knew at the time it was going to be bigger than Kings Canyon, and that was, you know, by design. And the other thing was that Kings Canyon, as a design principle, which was designed by Jason McCord, who eventually became our design director, he had a very focused idea on what he called the room concept. Was the idea is that you enter a choke point and you have this wide open area, and then ideally within 10 seconds you kind of know if someone's in the area. And if you look at an old Kings Canyon, you get that feeling if you enter, oh, there's another squad here, whether you hear them or you kind of just see a little bit of evidence that they've been here, so it puts you on point. And so Kings Canyon essentially is like all these rooms stitched together with like a center river section. And then with World's Edge, I had a lot more. Instead of doing a lot of these chokes, I thought like, well, what if you could actually see from afar? Like, you know, you can gauge somebody from a distance, meaning like, I know they're there. We can't fight each other yet, but I know where you're going and I can see where you're going. And so let's see if I can, over a lot of open space, close the distance in different ways, and when I take that away and when you open it up, as opposed to a lot of chokes. And that was like a specific goal to be different than what Kings Canyon was developing at the time.
Even as World's Edge was being developed by Rodney, there was never any certainty in whether this map would actually work in Apex Legends, as different maps and battle royales was still a relatively new thing in the early years of the battle royale boom.
The idea of doing another map was like, oh no, you can't do that, or can you? And so that was the big gamble. And so when World's Edge came out, I was really worried. I was like, everybody was already in love with Apex, and I'm like, I could be the guy who makes everybody hate Apex because we don't like this map. We like the old map better.
Season 3 eventually came around the corner, and with it, World's Edge was released to the public. And despite the worries of the team, it quickly left a positive impact on Apex as a whole, and Rodney, of all people, was happy to see that.
Well, man, it always feels good when one of your, you know, something you make is positively received. And like the first thing is like, oh, I guess I get to keep my job. That's good. But the other thing is like, I remember, I think it was Steven DeRose. He was another designer, like a weapons designer who I work with now at Wildlight. I think he came up to me at week 2 and says, hey, people are talking about the map being competitive. Did you make it competitive? And I'm like, well...
World's Edge would soon become a staple for Apex's competitive scene, the first real competitive map for Apex. But Rodney was quick to point out that it wasn't the only goal.
And I always knew, it's like, okay, this is competitively viable, meaning I'm not breaking anything, but I was really cognizant to not let it dictate something that could be cool. An example of that is the train. Like in a proper competitive map, you would never do something like that.
The train may have eventually left the station in World's Edge updates, but the spirit of keeping the fun mixed with competition stayed with Rodney in his future designs. After the release of World's Edge had been finished, Rodney Reese was given time off to relax after a long design period, with his next work in the game being a few small parts of the map Olympus. But despite positive receptions towards Olympus, the map was very quickly put aside by the competitive community. World's Edge stayed as the only competitive map even after a third map was introduced into the game. This created a problem. World's Edge had been the only competitive map consistently played on since Season 3. It was now Season 7, and despite the game changing a lot in that time, World's Edge had stayed, even if it had a few new coats of paint. Eventually, that had to change, and when Rodney was placed back on to design the 4th map for Apex, he already had ideas in mind for what needed to be solved.
Jason McCord got promoted to the design director of Apex. And so right before, I think it was like the winter of 2019, he kind of takes me aside of like, hey, maybe start thinking about a 4th map. And I'm like, we're going to do a 4th map? Because at that point, we didn't know how many, like, hey, we have 3. That's enough to keep doing updates to, and we might be done at making brand new maps. And we could just be iterating these 3, you know, kind of forever, really. And he said, yeah, just start thinking about a 4th map. But one of the problems we kept talking about was the third-party problem, where if you remember during, I think it was like Season 7, 8 time, people were really complaining about third parties. And that's sort of like, it's a given with, you know, Battle Royale. It's the very nature of it. But I was like, in the back of my mind wondering, like, is there anything in the level we could do to make third parties better? And then the other one was the unintended consequences of one of the things I did in World's Edge. And if you remember in the first version of World's Edge, if you remember Fuel Depot happened to be the exact center of the map. Like if you actually look in the game editor, it is 000. It is the exact center. And the very nature of a circle as a function of closing always forces people to go through 000. It will always happen, right? So hence it makes it the most traveled spot. And that little essentially passway between Capital City and Fuel Depot became the most murderous place in all of Apex. And we never experienced that internal playtest. And so in the back of my mind, I made a note of that. If I ever do another map, really think about what the center of the map is, with this idea of like, this can turn into the most bloodiest place ever. And so when Jason kind of gave me the tap of like, start thinking about the 4th map, I literally had a list of things over a year of like, I want to fix this, 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 and this.
As he started the layout for what would become Stormpoint, he had taken the idea of a tropical island map that had been thrown around the Respawn design team since the beginning of Apex's development, and worked to solve the first major issue, the choke at 000. While not as prevalent in future iterations of World's Edge, the choke point north of Harvester is considered to be a hotspot for major activity as the center of the map. Players would eventually run into it, and it created a problem as far too much of the action would revolve around it, an issue Olympus also suffers from in the Space Connecting Turbine and Hammond Labs.
In that early stages, the thing that was important was the original World's Edge problem was no POIs at 000. And matter of fact, nothing around that area, hence why that area is called the Forbidden Zone. Like, it wasn't a POI. And so I said, keep these POIs clear of this area. If you land in the middle of the map, you know, you're typically going outward. And I'd rather people land more on the perimeter and work their way through, because I'll create conflict lines. Like if I land in Stormpoint's example, if the circle eventually ends up in Lightning Rod and I land at, you know, fish farms, like I'm gonna have to go through the map to get that. And if I landed at Cenote and I have to do that, chances are I'll run into that person, hence it creates a good conflict area. Now, if you have a POI there, everybody's gonna land there, or a good chunk of people will land there. And then it sort of gets recycled. And so that was like one of the early ones to that whiteboard sketch of like nothing in the center.
By making the space around the center of the map a less popular place to land at, Rodney encouraged teams to space themselves out from the center. This became the Forbidden Zone, more commonly called Jurassic. Jurassic changed a lot in how Stormpoint fed players into the ring. World's Edge's choke-heavy design forced players to eventually go through a center point of the map, with alternative paths being far out of the way in comparison, whereas Stormpoint's center of Jurassic offered a variety of ways around it, creating new options for teams wanting to get into the ring without getting trapped in the cages of 000. The new ideas didn't stop at Jurassic, however, as another part had to be worked on by Rodney extensively, and that was Stormpoint's size.
And then knowing I wanted to make it big. I wanted to make it big because I wanted, for a competitive scene, I wanted opportunity for people to loot in isolation if they wanted to. And that was an important thing of like, if you want to be competitive, ideally you don't want to first fight. You know, people love first fights in the casual scene, but the competitive scene, they want to be geared up in that first drop, and ideally not have to fight unless you have to. And so creating more external areas would allow that of like, oh, if I see someone at fish farms, well, no one's at ship site, I can go there, and there's enough space where I'm like, they're not going to be here for another, if they come for us, they won't be here for at least 1 minute. That gives us time to loot, gear up, prepare.
Expanding the size of the map helped to separate the different POIs from each other, solving another large issue World's Edge suffered from, where some of the map's POIs were so close together that teams couldn't reasonably split them. From Big Mod and Stacks, to Lava Fisher and Mirage Voyage, to even Survey Camp and Epicenter. Despite being all named POIs, they often be taken by a single team, which limited the amount of options other teams had in landing alone. They either had to settle for something worse, or try to fight for the better picks. Stormpoint, in comparison, doesn't suffer as much from this problem, with large enough POIs spaced far enough throughout. Contests on Stormpoint are less out of necessity than on World's Edge. And with all of that size came one other aspiration for Rodney.
When doing the initial like just sketch of what Stormpoint was going to be, I was like, can I make 1/4 of this one giant mountain? And the reason for that was like making a giant hill that I wanted to for the ultimate slide, because I'm like, hey, that's just fun. But the other thing was when Jason McCord and I played Kings Canyon, when the plane came from the north and was like just head south, if you look down at the initial spawn when the plane was moving, there was at the top of one of the out of bounds rocks, there's this little lake. And I remember McCord and I would always look at that. It's like, fuck, wouldn't it be cool if you could just jump off right now and just be right there? And there's always this feeling of like, oh, the plane is like skimming the top of a mountain. Like, wouldn't that be cool? Wouldn't it be cool if there were clouds there and there was actually, and somehow we made that work. And so that was one of the big goals of Stormpoint of like, can I make that idea happen?
The mountain did come with its own issues, and namely, how players would be able to climb up it.
And so that was like the early play test. I was only concerned about that. Like, how's it feel going up and down the hill? And we actually brought in what we call Kleenex testers, where we actually brought in pros to play an early version. We NDA'd them up. And I remember I just sat with them. I'm like, what'd you think? And I'm like, oh, this is tough. I hate doing this and this and this. I'm like, okay, noted. And the problem I realized was everybody hated mantling when going up a mountain. And the reason they hated it was, oh, if I'm mantling, I'm putting away my gun and I can't shoot. Even though it's only a second, I hate doing that. And so it's like, okay. And there's lots of mantles, because the nice thing of like having a rock that you'd mantle over up a mountain was, oh, if I get to the rock, you know, if I'm up a hill and I have a rock like this, if I get to it, it's cover. Then I'll move around it or I'll climb up it and all that. But they hated that. So if I created, say, archways where, oh, the archway creates cover, but I can noodle my way through and never put my gun down. And that became the design principle of how to make a mountain work. That adds to so much when you all of a sudden, people hate that because they hate it for losing their combat efficiency, essentially. And that's one of those little things that will add up into, say, competitiveness, because competitive players never want to lose the ability to shoot somebody.
Over time, the adjustments they made to the mountain would eventually work out for the better, and Storm Point's steep hillside became a staple part of the map. The issue of third-partying was still prevalent in the mind even after all of these adjustments were made, and one major change they had for Storm Point was one of the ways Rodney sought to better it.
The biggest one, though, was one of those ticket items of like, how do I make third parties better on the map level, was what led to the decision to get rid of all the jump towers and come up with the gravity canyons. If I see two people fighting and there's a jump tower that's in range, I'm like, well, I can go third party this way and I can position myself anywhere to be advantageous to me. And that was one of the big bites out of what I thought was a bad third party experience. And so doing with the gravity cannons, where I'm like, these things are linked, you will only ever go to this position, maybe a little bit right and a little left. The biggest thing I was worried about is like, well, I'm removing a choice the player can make. Meaning like, oh, they love the ability to land wherever they want. And I took that away for the health of the game.
The largest map in Apex history, with a fourth of it being a gigantic mountainside, with less freedom of movement with the gravity cannons. There were a lot of opportunities for this new map design to fall flat on audiences with these alone. But another part of the map risked to be more controversial than the rest. The new Prowler dens and spider caves throughout Storm Point.
Midpoint, where Jason McCord came to me and he says, I really want to try AI. And I remember immediately I was like, no, you'll kill the competitive scene this way. Like the idea of AI, like that's, if you ever get killed by AI, like it's just the worst thing ever, right? One of our effects artists, you know, horrible at the game. And every time we have a playtest, die immediately. And I said, I just don't have fun with this game. And you can go one of two ways. You can say, well, the game's not for you, versus like, you want to like this game. What's a way you could get better and feel good about yourself? And so starting to think of like, okay, what if AI could be something that rewards you?
Out of all the changes made, adding AI was the largest gambit by Rodney and Respawn when it came to the map's competitive viability. If they were too disruptive, it would ruin the competition. But if they had no relevance at all, then they weren't fun for either competitive players or casual players. A balance had to be struck.
I have to place these in very specific areas where it's not going to kill something. And that's why in the choke points became the spiders, because the spiders don't interact with you unless you choose to. You have to shoot them. Hence, okay, that's why you can put them in choke points, because hey, if you want that, you chose that. But the other thing was like, this will give you loot. This will give you ammo. This will give you things. I'm like, a competitive player will appreciate that and they'll engage with it for that. Even though they'll say fundamentally they hate this idea, they'll still engage with it because it gives them something they want.
With the AI on the map built around rewarding the player, the final gambit had been laid. The new map of Storm Point had been formed, and as Season 11 was released to the public, the big question was asked: is Storm Point competitively viable? And the answer, soon enough, became perfectly clear.
Game number 1. And speaking of game number 1, the dropship is loading and flying across Storm Point for the first time here in ALGS. We got Storm Point competitive Apex on display. Oh, Zero's gonna do it! Wide left lane, and then just like that, Reignite is gonna do it! They are your champions! Last alive at Burholes, it's all up to Burholes! Dark Zero, he's out. Dark Zero looking to go back-to-back. Dark Zero is going to be your champion of the Apex Legends Global Series. Loba, TSM are your champions.
It did not take long after the release of Season 11 for Stormpoint to find its way into the competitive scene. Picked up by third-party tournaments, and soon enough, in ALGS with Year 2, Split 2 Pro League. Its introduction into the competitive scene shook the very foundations of how comp was played. The new map required different playstyles and mindsets than what World's Edge had taught pro players. Its larger size and verticality created more dynamic opportunities for fights and rotations, and most of all, it offered viewers a brand new experience to watch as the best of the best tackled this brand new environment. Rodney and the team at Respawn had done it, and now it's time for us to look at that map, part by part, to see how it really plays. It's 15% larger than World's Edge. Yeah, I think I'm gonna need some help. Hey, Jayhawk, how you doing, man? Yeah, I'm actually making that Stormpoint video. You interested?
No.
I best get started. Now, I already made an entire video talking about how good this POI is. Thankfully, the beacons on Lightning Rod have since been changed to only have one of each instead of two. Even with that change, this spot on the map is still one of the top dogs in both loot and rotation options, being able to fly down the mountain on the rotation with better gear on average. The only major downside of landing at Lightning Rod is the landing itself, as depending on the dropship, you have to use cannons and suboptimal looting paths to get everything you need. And when the ring pulls the Lightning Rod, well, you have an uphill battle to face. Literally, as every entrance to the POI is surrounded by steep mountainsides. Teams have to maneuver carefully to not get gatekept from either Thunderwatch, Old Armory, Zeus Station, or Spider Caves on their way in. A good thing to keep in mind is that if the ring pulls towards Thunderwatch, it'll most likely end towards the eastern terrain, whereas if it pulls closer to Lightning Rod, it's more likely to keep pulling to the northern buildings. Just pray that it doesn't end on the island. Imagine everything that Lightning Rod offers now in a smaller package, and you get Zeus Station, featuring a multi-layered center tower surrounded by two large compounds to the north and east. The south and west opened up with smaller buildings mixed in. Zeus Station shares an incredible amount of similarities to Lightning Rod, with the trade-off being its smaller size and loot pool, as well as no trident to work with. On the other end, you have faster looting times and the only jump tower on the entire map to rotate with. And on top of that, zones that end in Zeus Station are even harder to get into than Lightning Rod, with less options to rotate in front and even larger slopes to deal with. Your best bet as a southern team is to pray it pulls to the platform to the south and fight your way in late. Otherwise, it's a battle to hold the buildings inside of the POI, where you'll see tight endgames built out from the tower's multiple layers. Man, 18 more to go.
The wall is one of the most storied POIs on Stormpoint, considering that TSM famously managed to win 2 lands landing here. It has the benefit of being on the north side of the map, giving it prio to some of the more difficult northern zones. 4 buildings make up the loot at the main area of the POI, but you can also enter into the wall itself for more loot and access to a launcher that will take you to Northpad. When we get a wall pull, there are few playable spots early inside the POI as teams fill up the buildings and one team often holds the inside of the wall. Everyone else surrounds the outside, and fighting will break out until the circle forces teams to throw themselves inside and hope for the best. Getting there early and holding a building is the best course of action to ensure the best chance at success.
The early goal, again, one of the things you forget when a map first releases, it doesn't have as many POIs as the other maps do, because the other maps have added POIs with updates, right? And so I knew, I'm like, I want 17 POIs at the first version, right? And I knew that was going to be a sticking point for some people. Like, it doesn't have 20 POIs. Why don't you have 20 POIs? Like, that's just not in the production budget. The practical side was like, okay, for this POI, which would become Northpad, is I want to do something with the World War I idea, but what if I can also combine it with something I already built, which was the launch pad? I'm like, okay, I can take the launch pad, I can strip it down, and let me make this the exhaust. And then, yeah, the change was I wanted to create a very open area that was not just rocks everywhere where it looks like a spilled over Jenga set. That's one of my biggest pet peeves, of when layout looks like a Jenga set just fell over and just vomited cover. And I'm like, I want to do the trenches where, okay, I can go in the trenches, I can get my way out of there. If I know someone's about it, just peek your head, oh, there, and go back down. And if you don't, you can get shot. And if you're in the trenches, then you have very directional fighting. And so, yeah, that was like kind of the core of what Northpad was.
The trenches indeed offer a unique situation for teams playing in them. With no sightlines above, they have to work with the little space that is offered, and oftentimes holding these trenches early on will get you killed. But being able to control these spaces in the late game could mean the difference between a first place finish and a 10th place exit. On the back end, reusing the launchpad layout may have created a similar POI, but the play from it is very different. The 3 fingers on the backside of Northpad actually become viable space to hold even in the early game thanks to its new positioning, and places like the catwalk aren't as easy to hold from early on. Despite the similarities, these 2 POIs create completely unique experiences from them. Goes to show what a few small changes can do.
For example, in Checkpoint, I was always really liking an idea that I saw in the Fifth Element, where in Fifth Element, Bruce Willis is Corvallis, like he has Lilu, he's running away from the police, and there's this one line where they're flying through New York City, and they go straight down, and he sees a cloud line of like fog, and like, we make it through the fog, we can do it. I'm like, I always love that idea of like, oh, I'm overwhelmed. Just if I can get past, jump off and make that line, I'm safe. And so the idea of like, oh, what if Checkpoint, the POI is above a tree line that is so densely foliated that you land, very basic setup of like this side fights this side. But if we get overwhelmed, just jump off. And all of a sudden now we're in a very canopied dark area, and at least we can maybe play a little more cat and mouse versus the direct fight we're having. So that, like that one idea, that's the entire point of that POI.
Checkpoint also happens to live up to its name, as teams landing at the POI are able to catch teams looking to rotate past them for early KP. The entire area around Checkpoint is a checkpoint in and of itself. Enclosed within a circle of mountains, this POI is isolated from any other location in the game, requiring you to clear past one of the 4 different choke points to enter and exit it. Rings with Checkpoint inside of it are games of trying to beat these chokes, or hoping you don't have to get out of it on a bad ring pull.
Cascades is dead center on Storm Point, giving it solid rotates to a majority of the map. It's extremely quick to loot and does have a spider cave nearby, so you can farm a bit and then leave quickly. The loot is pretty mediocre overall though, considering the lack of quantity. It used to be considered one of the top POIs, but as the map has evolved and more POIs have been added and upgraded, it feels as though Cascades has fallen back in the pack. When the zone does pull here, the playable spots are limited to the handful of buildings. The surrounding hills offer little playable space, so the teams who get here early will often take the win, but there are so many possible end zones that can slightly pull outside of Cascades, leading to a bloodbath from all the building teams as they're forced to leave their cover earlier than expected.
Command Center was sort of at a necessity, because when the mountain became solidified, I'm like, there needs to be a fast way up this mountain. And I think Command, like, you know, having the longest, as I jokingly said, I'm going to make the longest zip line in the world to get up this thing, right? So that was its primary purpose, number one, of like, this is the quick way of like, I don't want to climb another hill. I want to get to the top of this thing because I have to. It's like, okay, a POI that cuts through the mountain, sort of like Cheyenne Mountain, was always my like kind of touchstone. Was like, oh, if you can go through a mountain base that gets you to the top of this 10,000 unit mountain, good.
Command Center as a POI is one of the more poorly kitted locations in the game, but teams can make up that difference in quality with extremely fast rotation options. Teams on the Haida Command can use an evac tower to fly across the map quickly, and the POI's central location gives it direct access to a ton of ring pulls. And thankfully, Command is not a POI the zone can end on, as being inside a command is often like being in a completely different map. where you have no idea what is going on when you are inside of it. With limited entry options and no view of the greater map, you best be careful not to get trapped within.
I was surprised how much the Stormcatcher actually ended up working. Stormcatcher was one of those ones that went through a lot of iterations, and it was one of the earliest ones I did. But in terms of layout, it was not revolutionary, and I was trying to what is the thing about this? And it took forever to essentially come up with oh, what if it's suspended? Well, that's kind of interesting. Let's play with that. And then it really clicked when it became because even then it was okay, this is okay, but it isn't setting the world on fire. I wish there was something more I could do. And then when Stormpoint became a sibling companion of Thunderwatch by connecting him with the two towers, all of a sudden I'm oh my god, this is one POI where it's sectioned. Then I was really happy with that one. And then when I saw ALGs in there in between the two, I'm ooh, this could be some spice right now.
Stormcatcher really is a surprisingly effective POI for endgames. Despite being on a large mountainside with a ton of open ground, there's an effective amount of playable space for teams to move in from. Whether it's the lower platform and stairs coming up to the POI, the multiple buildings on either side, or even the terrain surrounding the main build. The mountainside to Thunderwatch is an especially interesting one, as the built-in cover around the slopes make it easier to play there even when the Stormcatcher height is looking to pick you off. And endgames all around the POI make teams have to scrap for as much as they can when their preferred choice gets pulled away. As a landing spot though, there's definitely better. If a POI had to be given the title of the Geyser of Storm Points, it'd probably be Stormcatcher. But hey, still a fun place to be at. Also, wait, has this tunnel been here the entire time? I've never seen this before. When did it get here? Added in Season 13, Down Beast is a POI with a problem that I would like to coin as the Dome Problem. The Dome Problem is an issue that largely appears on World's Edge with the POI Dome, where multiple POIs surrounding the landing spot make it hard to rotate out from. Down Beast suffers from the Dome Problem thanks to having Mill to its south, Checkpoint to its east, and North Pad to its north. Man, who'da thunk? However, unlike Dome, Down Beast can actually manage with the Dome Problem. The POI is large enough for 3 players to be fully kitted leaving it, making it a good POI to play Edge from, alongside a nearby Trident allowing for extra maneuverability.
And the biggest thing was essentially the roundness was that you have the center, which is very very basic, but the flanks, the internal flanks, where it was this curved staircase that goes up, right? And it was very important. This is one of the things I followed Jose about because his original version didn't have the sight lines. Whereas when you enter that doorway in your FOV, even if you're at 70, you see the bottom of it, the top, and then everything this way. And so you have a very focused fight. So I mean, you open the door, oh shit, there's a squad, do. And so that was the core of that flank. I'm and that flank is duplicated on the other side and duplicated on the other one. And it boils down to that basic of it's an inside space where I'm allowed to use my abilities and not essentially fight like I'm outside, but be inside with the restrictions of I can only go forward or backwards. That's all I can do.
The two halves forming one large POI has proven to be an incredibly good landing spot to play from, as shown by Dark Zero winning a land from it. The great loot at the bins in the center, the multiple no-name builds surrounding it, and the access to a Trident made it both good for fighting teams looking to be aggressive, and good for teams wanting to take good spots within the ring, though its rotations have worsened a bit with the introduction of Ceto Station into the area. Rodney's wish for Mill's style of combat stays true in the endgames on Mill, as you'll often find 2 layers of action going on at any given time. The outside control for the Mill height, and the corridor pushes to control the inside. Often isolated enough to take the chance at those fights even when there is a team nearby. This does not hold true for teams getting into Mill, as they have to fight tooth and claw for usable terrain as they move their way towards the buildings. Just don't try to walk in from the checkpoint side.
Cenote Cave is one of the largest POIs on Stormpoint in terms of overall territory, but most of it is covered in massive rock structures that make it difficult to navigate. Because of this, contests here can take ages, with so much terrain to separate teams and the buildings that contain the loot. There is a Trident and a Spider Cave here, so Cenote does have options for farming armors and rotations, but with its location in the far southwest corner, Cenote teams will lack prio to most of the map. Endgames here are rare due to the terrain, but when it does pull to Cenote, things can get really interesting. With so much verticality, rock cover, and buildings located within the POI, as well as many ways to enter in, a multitude of teams can get packed into these endgames, and it becomes extremely unpredictable who can take the win.
I asked Rodney about this specific location not because it was a POI, but rather because of how it became one despite not being a named location, thanks to the introduction of the armory.
So that was actually, even though that specific wasn't like planned for me, one of the things I did plan for with Stormpoint was the fact that there would be updates to it. Like when we did World's Edge and when we did Kings Canyon, we didn't know there were going to be map updates. We didn't know the maps were going to change. So I knew it would change with time. And so that's why I specifically left certain areas non-POIs to essentially like a new POI will probably go there. It's a ripe opportunity. And so seeing it shift like that, totally understandable. And like, you know, one of those things I'm like, oh, good. Like what it happened.
After Season 19 removed the armories, being as a POI is not as good as it used to be, with its only benefit being the crafter. However, some teams are able to take advantage of another location nearby, the God Cave, or as Rodney likes to call it, the AOB Cave. You know.
It was actually, the code name I gave it was AOB Cave. I think it's still in there. I hope it's still there. It's called AOB, which was stood for Ass on Boat, which was inspired by, I took a trip to the British Virgin Islands where a lot of Stormpoint was inspired by, and our code for our group that was on this yacht was called AOB, called Get Your Ass on the Boat. I mean, we're leaving, get your ass on the boat. And so that was my little call to it. And I remember, yeah, that cave, I was like, I'm going to give a little secret for the 9 people who know. Well, now everybody can know. It's been too long now.
The biggest thing to mention about endings at Bean is one particular place that every team has to watch out for. An ultimate height location that can pick off anybody from every direction. The God Rock. Teams can play on top of the God Rock and use snipers and marksmen to terrorize the teams below. And if you are one of those teams, you have to be careful not to leave yourself exposed to the God Rock team, or else you're about to have a very unfortunate headshot clip posted on Reddit later. Another addition from Season 19, Ceto Station replaces the Prowler Island that once populated this stretch of land between Cascades and Mill. Following the same design from Zeus Station, Ceto features the tower, plus one additional compound to the north, with small battery and pyramid buildings scattered around it. The placement of this POI makes it a gateway for many teams rotating through it, as you have to be careful not to get caught out from a team on the height. Its proximity to so many other locations makes endgames at Ceto Station difficult to tell. Even when it's clear the ring is pulling to Ceto, teams never really know if it'll end in Ceto proper, or in areas like Bean, Jurassic, or Cascades. It's one of the few end zone POIs where you really roll the dice on whether it will end inside of it.
Barometer was a big one because the tower was always there. Like I always knew it was like, that's meant to be a tower. The balance of the tower was, I didn't want them to be like the watchtowers in Kings Canyon, where you have this thing of you're on the tower and you're shooting, say, someone below you, right? Well, if they shoot back, all you got to do is just walk away and then they can't see you. And so with Barometer, the tower is all catwalks on the side. So if I step back, they can still shoot me. And if you actually look at the cover, they actually has a gap underneath the railing. That gap is there so that someone from the ground can still shoot them. And you have nowhere to go except inside. So you open the door, you go inside, and now you've broken the fight. Hence, the person on the ground has an opportunity to close the distance, get up through every method they want. So that was how that was going to work. And Art said, like, oh, this looks like a Godzilla building. We want to make it flat. And I'm like, no, it can't be flat for this reason. That was the one where art really like bent over backwards and designed what we called the Godzilla head shape of it. Because the other thing was like, well, you can't stand on top of it because then we just introduced the problem again. So you have to be able to reasonably slide off. And hence, you know, that's the one where design block at 1, then back to me happened a few times trying to make this all work. And they bit the bullet on me for that because I recognized how much they hated that building and the shape of like, this doesn't make sense as a building. And I'm like, yes, it does. You just see it from your art eyes that way.
The building may have been designed to be more fair, but that doesn't mean that it isn't an ultimate height. The team atop the tower can control a majority of the entire area around Barometer with a good sniper mixed in, let alone if a team has a rampart up there. Ugh. Barometer's similarities can mostly be found in Thermal Station on World's Edge, a super large POI where endings within the location are really a toss-up of where it could end. And there really isn't a universally best spot, not even the ultimate height. You best get used to running through the water.
It was known as the Forbidden Zone and, you know, got known as Jurassic, and that's not an accident. Like, I knew what I was doing when I was building that.
Clever girl.
As mentioned earlier, Jurassic is the area meant to solve the original World's Edge problem. This open space with minimal loot makes it less favorable to go through on the rotation. Originally, Jurassic was full of prowler nests that would attack teams moving through. But after Season 19, they were replaced by a handful of buildings as well as a gravity cannon connecting to Pylon. It no longer holds that forbidding quality it once had, but Jurassic still doesn't suffer from the old choke point problem that persisted with other maps. Jurassic also had the fun quirk of being a landing spot for teams in ALGS. Much like Landslide on World's Edge, this location's terrible loot is offset by the incredible central location it offers. Literally. That does mean, however, that teams must play around its weaknesses to find any success. So don't expect to be a hyper-aggressive Edge team from here. Pylon, Pylon, Pylon. This is another POI that I already gave plenty of thoughts about in this other pretty cool video you should definitely check out. The broken nature of the triple ultra loot at the height has since been changed. Now only one ultra spot exists in the center room of the tower, so this spot isn't as broken as it started out as. But it's still pretty great.
Nice.
Now I never got the chance to talk about endgames in Pylon, because compared to other new POIs, this POI is among the densest for final rings to end in, with 3 separate buildings surrounding its already spacious center. There are plenty of buildings and holding spots for teams to fill into, with that multi-layered tower once again making squads stack up against each other on each level of the tower. Finding a spot you can hold in this POI is easier than most, but the space you have to share with others will become tight, and teams have to play carefully to not get caught out. Earlier, I talked about the dome problem, where the POI of Dome is a hard place to play from thanks to its positioning around the other powerful POIs. Down Beast suffers from the dome problem, but can offset it with its size, loot, and trident. Coastal Camp, however, has none of that, and is in fact the Dome of Stormpoint, with Barometer, Pylon, and Echo HQ in the front, and endless ocean behind. Coastal Camp offers the worst rotations on the entire map. On top of that, the POI itself is tiny, with barely enough loot to kit out 3 players. And with a fast looting time, you'll end up having to wait for larger POIs around you to leave before you can even begin your macro. It's bad. The open area that surrounds Coastal Camp's north is the zone every team has to move through on a coastal endgame. And if you're lucky, you're not the team caught in a rain of bullets when you try to cross it.
Devastated Coast is a new POI between Echo HQ and Launchpad over on the southeast corner of the map. Because of its limited loot and location, it will often be double claimed by the Launchpad team, only boosting their control even more. If a team does land here though, it is easy to loot as there are only a handful of broken buildings on the low ground and then a couple on the height by the bridge. Zones that end here are dicey as there are buildings, but as the name of the POI implies, they're not exactly structurally sound, so they are easier to breach than normal. There's also the unique aspect with one building being lifted into the sky by a crane, whatever team lands here tends to take this as they are very safe and overlook all of the surrounding area. This can feed them kills as teams struggle to find playable space nearby, and often this team is going to be a favorite for the team who could take the win in the end.
Despite being a POI on the far edge of the map, Echo HQ is a surprisingly easy location for teams to rotate into. This POI is one of the most layered locations of any landing spot in the game, and its multi-story layout and density makes it prime for teams trying to evac into a spot in the mid-game. That said, it can be dangerous to walk into the POI late, as the ways in from Devastated Coast and Pylon are very open and easy to get shot from, especially as more teams pile into the POI. Rotations from Echo HQ share a lot of similarities to Launch Site on World's Edge, where teams around Echo have good chances of ruining your rotation, but are either going to rotate ahead of you, or try to avoid you as you will leave HQ better kitted than they will be. That's 19 landing spots, and there's one left to go. Let's finish this out with...
Launchpad has always been one of the better POIs on Stormpoint, but as of Season 20, it has gotten even better. With the changes to the armor system, POIs with the ability to farm armors via PvE have become far more important, and Launchpad has access to 2 separate spider nests and a prowler den. With all this PvE, Launchpad is an incredibly strong POI for any team that controls it. Rotations are rather easy as well. The POI is located in the southeast corner of the map, so rotating north is as simple as going along the eastern coast. Launchpad endings are strange because they tend to pull to the water south of the POI where very little cover exists, so most of the fighting happens well before we reach the final zone as teams hold out choke points around the POI or fight within the tunnels and the building of Launchpad itself.
With the Launchpad, we have covered nearly every location on Stormpoint, but even all of this doesn't cover everything that this map has to offer. What we have learned, however, is how Stormpoint took the format that World's Edge had set and sought to improve it in every conceivable way. From decentralizing the action, to spacing out the POIs, to creating fantastic new locations to fight in. Everything from each rock and blade of grass was made to make the best possible experience within it. A map like this isn't easy to make, and as much as Rodney designed it, these maps are never made by one man alone.
This was the class photo for World's Edge, right? Like, I was the layout designer of this, right? And I'm right there, but all these people made World's Edge, right? And like, none the least of like, you know, this guy right here, Robert Tobby, who was our art director, who's like the one who did this, and that's Jason McCord, who like, you know, was my lead, and then Jose, like all those people made these maps.
Every single map in the game had days, weeks, months, even years of hard work put into them, formed by talented artists and designers to create them. Trying their best to make something that will leave an impact on the game they spend their lives working on. And in the case of Stormpoint, that work paid off.
Stormpoint is the golden standard for a competitive Apex Legends map, whether it's the sizing and the spacing of the POIs being much larger than some of the other maps to allow for better rotations or fights, the PvE to allow you to get more loot, more heals, more attachments, and farm your armor up against the prowlers, the spiders, the flyers, or even bringing over like the trident from Olympus. So many intentional design choices from the dev team on this map are just, it's separated it from all the others in terms of the competitive experience, and in my opinion, it's the best map that they've ever released.
I mean, I think Stormpoint as a comp map is amazing. I love watching Stormpoint.
Stormpoint added diversity to competitive Apex. For so long, it was just World's Edge, which could easily get dull with time. It also felt like it was developed with pro play in mind, from its size to more POIs, to more ways to get loot and even upgrade your evos. And since its release, it's where every single LAN has been won. It's literally where champions are born.
And here we go. Get me the fuck off World's Edge. We are now heading over to Stormpoint, baby.
Stormpoint is the best map they've ever made.
The introduction of Stormpoint and its emphasis on controlling height and wide open spaces has taught the highest level of competitive Apex a lot about how to be more aggressive and not just how to survive, but how to thrive in the mid and late game.
Stormpoint has left its impact on Apex Legends as a whole, and will continue to be the stage for many future stories to come. The legacy will continue on. And thanks to that, Stormpoint will always be remembered as the perfect competitive map in Apex Legends. A huge thank you goes out to Rodney Reese for taking the time to talk with me about his time working on Stormpoint. He and many other former members of Respawn Entertainment have moved on from Apex and are now working at the studio Wildlight Entertainment, where they are hard at work at brand new games behind the scenes. The full interview I had with Rodney Reese will be made available to my supporters here on YouTube. Another big thank you goes out to Jayhawk for taking part in this project, as well as all of the members of the Apex community who recorded tributes for the end montage. All of their socials can be found in the description. And this video would not have been made possible without the help of Risen Rose, who helped me with gathering all of the map footage used throughout the entirety of this video, as well as the amazing members of the community who took part as actors for all of the scripted sections. Finally, thank you to you for watching right now. This was the largest project I have ever worked on, and I cannot be any more thankful for all of the people who watch and support my content. You're the reason any of this is possible. Whether it's watching and liking my content, to watching and chatting with me on Twitch, to even supporting or subscribing me on either platform. Thank you. If there are any other parts of competitive Apex you want me to cover next, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, this has been MooreOver. Have a lovely day.